Hi there, students. This is your Professor Chuck, and today we're going to be talking about problems with defining death. This is week 3, Science and Values, and today I just want to go over some background about the definition of death debate, especially here in America. All right, so I should warn you, there's a lot of background knowledge that I have to kind of give you here, and the reason why is because I specialize in this area. This is an active area of research for me, and I've written extensively about this. So you'll just have to bear with me if it seems like overkill. This is just what happens when you research a topic to death, and then you have to teach undergraduates about it. You kind of tend to just like totally you say, hey, take a drink from this fire hose. Okay, so if it feels like that, that's why. Just a little word of warning there. So to warm up, all right, let's consider this case. We got a 22-year-old guy, right? Now he's been in a care facility for 5 years after a severe brain injury, right? Now, here's the thing. He's not on any life support machines, okay? So he's not hooked up to a ventilator or dialysis machine, all right? He can breathe on his own, and, you know, he does need to have a feeding tube, though. He can't feed himself. Right, he can be aroused. So what's happening here is that he wakes up, right, eyes open, right. You know, maybe you'll look around, you know, a little bit. He'll recoil from painful stimuli, but he shows no awareness whatsoever of his surroundings. Okay, and the thing is here is this is the other point is that he will never be able to respond to the people or things around him in any kind of purposeful or agental way, right? Now, when you hook an EEG monitor up to his brain, his head, right, you see some waves. So there's some brain activity going on, okay? One way of kind of describing this state, this physical condition that he's in, is, since he's able to kind of wake up from taking a nap, the lights are on, okay, but nobody's home, right? There's just not any, he just shows no signs of any kind of awareness, all right? Okay, so that's the case, all right? Obviously a sad one. Now, here's some questions I want you to consider. Is this person dead or alive? Okay, it's a big question. Second question I want you to consider is this, is that would you be willing to donate this person's organs if she had signed, or he or she, actually in this case it's a he, I made it a he just kind of for simplicity's sake, right? A donor card. Oh, all right, there's Java, okay. Anyway, so here's the thing. Would you be willing to donate the person's organs, right? And I should also ask you this. Now, I'm not just talking about like donating a kidney. I'm talking about donating all of their organs, right? So heart, lungs, both kidneys, liver, pancreas, right? Portions of the intestine, all right? We could talk about corneas, heart valves, all that kind of stuff, all right? So that is what I'm talking about, and that's a different ballgame, right? So consider that scenario, okay? And that will tell you something about maybe some of your intuitions about what you think death is, okay? That's what I'm wanting to get at here. Now, this is not an original case to me. This comes from a study in 2004 that was done. And what was interesting, I think they surveyed medical professionals, if I'm not mistaken. Now you have to check the details of the study. But 34% of the people who responded said that the description above, which is the description of someone who is in a persistent vegetative state, right, is a description of death. Okay, so I don't know how it's going to track in our class, right? But it would be interesting to see, right, if that tracks in our class. And so I wanted you to kind of answer that question before I showed you this, and be honest if you can, right, in the class discussion, right? Here's another fact: is that a third of people would volunteer the organs of this person, even if the person was judged to be alive. Okay, so that is kind of an interesting fact about people. Now, this study was done in Ohio, so we'll see how South Carolina differs. I don't know if there's going to be much difference with you all, but that is kind of where we're at. And I don't think that has changed much. Now, I don't know if this has been replicated. It's been a while. It is a bit dated, but it is an interesting result. Okay, so it tells us something about, well, what do we think death is? Okay, is it just becoming unconscious, right? And also has to do with when can we start instrumentalizing the body, right? Because things like death that death marks a point when we can start instrumentalizing the body and say, okay, well, there are some people over here who need organs. You got them, and they aren't doing you much good, and so we're just going to take them, right? And now, usually, we want death to be that boundary line between, hey, you can now give up all your organs. That's called the dead donor rule. All right, and these people here, they don't really seem to care about that. All right, so anyway, this is an interesting topic. This is what I wrote my dissertation on, if you're interested. But so this is the angle I'm going to come at, okay, with thinking about this issue. So let's talk about defining death. Let's get into the background here, okay? Now, before 1968, in common law tradition, death was defined as the total stoppage of the circulation of blood and a cessation of the animal and vital functions consequent thereon. So respiration, pulsation, what have you. Now, obviously, people could tell that someone was dead when they're decapitated. Okay, so the guillotine in France, all right, the blood is still going to flow for a bit. Okay, but obviously in that case, right, the person's dead. Also, too, with hangman technology, they got kind of good at this, and they figured out how to break your brainstem in half. Especially, and they wanted to avoid decapitation, actually, with hangman technology. I know this is kind of gross, right? I'm sorry if this is kind of squeamish for you, but they wanted to avoid that, and so one of the ways to do that was to break the brainstem at the pons and medulla section, and that would basically kill you. All right, so that was a technique as well. All right, but this is what's on the books, basically, is that we're kind of looking at what's going on with the heart. Now, in 1968, Harvard decided to hold an ad hoc committee. So this was a committee of I think it was 10 doctors and then 3 people who weren't doctors, right? That was in the reading. And they decided to come up with a different definition of death. They wanted to add to this. They didn't want just circulation to be kind of the only way you could determine death. They wanted another one, right? And so there's this idea called irreversible coma, right? And now Veitch, in the paper you read, he conflates that with a different state. This is actually a very technical term that was discovered in France that basically is the criteria for brain death. All right. So I think that Veitch is a little. I mean, there are comas that you can call irreversible, right? That certainly is a good description of things. But this is kind of a technical term, and so I just want you to be aware of that. Now, the reason why they did this, okay, is there were 2 reasons here, right? And I think you can see this. The first one had to do with improvements with resuscitation technology. So things like the ventilator came along, and you could support bodies that were in this limbo for a very long time. And it was considered life-sustaining technology, and it had to be administered until the point of death. I think Veitch is right about that. That's just kind of the way that medicine had evolved. You get this new technology that supports life. Life is kind of what you're supposed to protect as a medical doctor, and so it's administered until the body just fails. Of course, this just becomes kind of pointless, though. There's no way this person's going to recover. The person's just taking up a bed, right? Or at least this body is, and the brain is completely failed. And everything else, the person, you take them off the respirator, and there's no breathing, okay? And when there's no breathing, there's not going to be a heartbeat for very much longer. And so it seems like what's happening here is that the damage is so extensive that and so devastating that this seems to cross into the area of death. All right. Another problem that they had noticed that they call this obsolete criteria, and that's the criteria that we're talking about up here, 1968, and we're talking about circulation criteria. They call this obsolete for some reason. Is that this can lead to controversy in obtaining organs for transplantation. All right, so what they would do, right, is they would want to take a kidney from somebody who's in this kind of state, but they'd have to wait for the heart to stop. But if you do that, the organ that you're trying to salvage then really suffers a lot of damage. Right? It suffers lack of oxygen. The technical term's called hypoxia, and then the organ's no good. And so then it's like, well, can't we take the organ quicker? Oh boy, this creates all kinds of conflicts with the law, with families, and so the idea is, well, did you mutilate a body for no medical reason before death was declared? And so one thing that would be really handy, right, is to have a definition of death that could get you the organ, right, in a body that's circulating oxygenated blood, okay, but whose brain is just gone, right? It's just not working anymore. And so that way you could get a nice kind of fresh organ out of the body, right? And so this is looking kind of controversial. It's like, are we kind of fudging with the definition of death here in order to kind of facilitate organ transplant? I mean, yes, there's this first thing, but the second one, boy, I mean, that's a little worrisome. All right, so if you read the ad hoc paper, and look, you can Google this, you can find this online. It's just everywhere, right? It's one of the most cited papers in all of medicine. And it's not very long, actually, and they don't cite any scientific studies at all for this. They only cite one document. That's a document by the Pope. It's a very strange document. But they give 4 criteria. The person has to be unresponsive. Now, what that means is, right, no response to painful stimuli. Okay, so poking them with a pin, right? You take a cotton swab and poke them in the eye. Okay, there's not going to be that reflex. Okay, that's actually one of the things. Other reflexes have to do, I think, with I forget now. The nervous reflexes in the joints. All right, and I think the eye one is a good example. No breathing. All right, and then they said no EEG, meaning no brain waves. All right, so that's what I mean by no EEG. All right. So anyway, that's the deal. Okay, so none of those kind of brainstem mediated responses, and then no brain waves. We don't want any residual evidence of consciousness, right? And that's going to define what's called whole brain death, and that is supposed to be the death of a human being. Okay, all right. So that's what they were trying to do. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is purporting to be a medical definition of death. And in 1969, there was a conference in Cape Town with some organ transplanters who were there, and they're all physicians, they're all surgeons, and it was about heart transplants. Okay, and here's what one surgeon had to say. He said, "In fact, the final analysis of death must always remain a medical decision made by physicians." Okay, so once, and then he says this, right? So once the human personality has irreversibly disappeared, the patient then does become an organ donor or potential donor. Okay, so there's a couple different ways you could read this. Is that, yes, it may be the fact that death is a medical decision, but is this a medical decision? That doesn't seem like one at all. That's a value judgment for sure. All right. And so, is death the time when her human personality has disappeared, or does it happen beforehand? Okay. So there's a lot of questions here that aren't getting answered. All right. And so there's some confusion that's resulting. And in 1971, Beecher and Dorr. Now, the reason I bring up Beecher's name here okay, is that he is actually the principal author of this Harvard ad hoc committee. He was a Harvard anesthesiologist, and he headed this thing up, right? He's one of the principal draftsmen of the committee's paper. And so in response to some questions about what's going on here, how do we understand what you're saying, he and his co-author in 1971 then said this: the individual's personality, his conscious life, his capacity for remembering, judging, reasoning, acting, enjoying, and so on, is such that when the brain no longer functions, the word is there, the patient no longer exists as a person. He is dead. Okay? And then he had to say this, okay? He had to say this: at whatever level we choose to call death, it's an arbitrary decision. And this was kind of seen to be pretty dissatisfying. All right, so we got this nice statement from Harvard, right, that kind of gave us some nice physiological criteria, but now we're confusing concepts like, the existence of persons, which seems to be here, a matter of the existence of consciousness, is now being conflated with death, right? And so, then that doesn't seem very arbitrary. That seems like something that, okay, maybe medical science could determine that. But that can be really, really fuzzy. How do you diagnose that? And then he goes on to say, well, at whatever level we choose to call death, it's arbitrary. Well, if it's an arbitrary decision, then it's not a medical decision anymore. Okay? That should be obvious. If things that are arbitrary, here's a little Aristotle for you. He said, the most important things in life cannot be arbitrary. And I think he's right about that, okay? And death is an important thing in life. And so how we determine it just can't be an arbitrary thing, right? It certainly can't be a medical thing if it's arbitrary, right? And you might as well just roll the dice. Now, he was probably working with a narrower sense of arbitrary there, but I think this is just an irresponsible thing to say as a medical professional and as somebody who's trying to define death for the whole United States. All right, so that's my little sermon there. I just want to leave you with that. Leave you to think about that and reflect on that. And people realize this, and they think, okay, well, what we need to do is rein things back in here. It's like, this is getting a little too out of control. And so physicians weren't nearly as radical in their stance on this as Beecher. And Beecher was a good man, by the way. I'm not trying to throw him under the bus. He did a lot of great things in exposing abuses in research and stuff like that. But on this, I just think that he just didn't really help a lot. Here's the deal, all right? Is that physicians want to make death a medical event, all right? So we're going to think about that. And so what they debated then in the 1970s, kind of after Beecher and Dorr, is they said whether or not death is an event or a process. And the event view kind of won the day. Still debated though, right? But that's kind of an important debate to pay attention to in this unit. And then in 1972, we saw some statutory definitions come along, right? Kansas was the first to come up with it. There's a nice paper I linked to here that kind of gets into all that, right? And there's 4 levels here that have to go into a death definition, right? So lawyers got involved here, right? It can't purely be determined by doctors because doctors seem to disagree here. We have people talking about whether or not death is an event or a process, whether death has to do with consciousness. If it's just that, then why the whole brain? Why not just part of the brain? I mean, doctors are kind of, okay, we got to get the law involved here because we got to have a nice binary line. You're either dead or you're alive, and you got to give us some criteria to follow, okay? And so these 4 things, these 4 ideas really start to matter. Okay, so we have to have a death concept. This is going to be an abstract philosophical concept. So you might think of a classical one. Death is the separation of the soul from the body. Okay, that is a philosophical concept, right? And no amount of empirical evidence is going to be able to determine that. All right. So, what you got to have then is something that's empirically detectable. Okay, so you might come up with some physiological criteria that are going to maybe like signify the separation of the soul or the loss of the organism as a whole or something like that. Okay, then you're going to have operational criteria. Okay, so what do we got to observe, and then what do we have to rule out? Okay, because there are things And this is actually mentioned in the ad hoc report. Something like barbiturate overdose. All right, that's going to resemble the brain death state a lot, but that's a reversible state. Okay, you can pull somebody out of that. Hypothermia is another one. All right, so you got to be able to rule that stuff out. All right, and so that's an operational criteria, and then you're going to have tests for irreversibility. These are gonna have to do with like time constraints, right? How long has this been going on? All right, and once those kind of get satisfied, then you could say that there's no comeback here. All right, and that seems to be an important part of a death concept, is that it's not reversible, at least by anything that we can do. You know, maybe God can perform a miracle, but we're not God, so there's that. All right, okay. So this ends up kind of gaining some traction, and in 1981, all right, the law finally gets clarified for good, and it says this is on the books. You can look this up. This is the Uniform Determination of Death Act. That's what that stands for. Uniform Determination of Death Act, right? So it says this: in a person or an individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. Okay, so that's still in there. That's not obsolete. Or irreversible cessations of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem, is dead. And a determination of death must be made in accordance with accepted medical standards, right? So that's the law. And that quickly became adopted in all 50 states and has been exported the world over. It's actually one of the great and amazing, stunning successes of medical and legal theory kind of coming together and achieving a consensus. And this is it. It's really kind of amazing, right? You can read about the consensus in the President's Commission's report on this issue. I got a link to it here, and maybe I think I will take, well, you know what, I won't take you there. But there was a philosophical assumption made in it, and that is that the death is the collapse of the integrated functioning of the organism as a whole. Right? So this idea of the organism as a whole is an important one in this debate. Right? So that's the death concept they chose to use. They found that to be religiously neutral, and also something that is within the province of biology. And of course, medicine and biology are friends. Right? You can kind of see how this all kind of works out. So you have to understand here that brain death, in this view, is a sign of biological death. Okay, that's important. There aren't two deaths here. All right, there's not two deaths. There's not heart death and brain death, and they're just for different purposes. That's not how it works. Okay, it's actually these two things are related. They're windows into the human body that we can look at, and empirically detectable things that we can determine and say, okay, the person's dead. All right. So that's how you need to understand this. Okay, and I'm sorry this took a long time to set up, but it's really important to kind of understand the controversy over this. All right, so I want you to think about whether or not it's a good assumption. Okay, is this how we should understand death? Okay, or should we think of it more in a personalist idea and consciousness? Okay, so think about that. Right. However, there are problems that come up with the medical view of death. All right, there are problems, as you might expect. All right, even though it's widely accepted, it's widely agreed upon. There's different tests around the country for this. There's different clinical procedures in every different hospital. There's different lingo, like clinical death, brain death. I mean, what are people talking about? It's not always clear. And this UCLA neurologist, published a series of papers in the 90s and culminated in 2001 that he just came to believe that brain death does not signify a biological death. Right? And he found all these really interesting and unusual cases of people who are brain dead living onwards for years. I mean, now this doesn't typically happen usually when somebody suffers brain death. There's a cascade of catastrophic events that lead to organ failure and all kinds of things that usually people, they just don't survive, right? When you suffer the brain death diagnosis and injury, okay? However, there are some exceptional cases where this is not the case. Bodies persist on. And he observed the following, is that you had homeostasis, right? Especially in the lower half of the body. You see this everywhere, okay? That chemical process of life, right? Other things, right? Expulsion of cellular waste, right? Energy balance, okay? So endocrine, functioning, right? You have fighting against infections. This is really kind of astonishing, right? Wound healing. So, people they get bed sores, they have to be turned over. Again, these cases are exceptional because usually people withdraw life support when their loved one's brain dead, okay? But not everybody does that, okay? And from the reading about Jahi McMath that you had to do, there's a case, right? Signs of puberty, right? You read about Jahi McMath possibly going under the menstruation process, right? These are other things that the Schumann guy observed in brain dead bodies. Proportional growth. There's one kid who died of meningitis when he was 4, and the parents took care of the body until he was about 20. So the body grew in that time, right, and went through all these things. The case is named TK. If you type in on Google TK brain death case, Schumann will come up, right, and you can read about it. It's pretty incredible. And then there's cases of women, right, who have suffered brain death, and yet were far along enough in their pregnancy that they were able to gestate a fetus until viability, and the baby was delivered then by cesarean section at the point of viability. Now it's premature, but these, there's kids, right, who've come out of brain dead bodies. All right, so you might think here that, hey, I don't know if this is really death. Okay, I mean this is looking like organism as a whole kind of behavior. Okay. What's interesting here is that the government issued a white paper. This is President Bush's President's Council to respond to Schumann, that actually ended up rejecting the integrative unity rationale for death that was actually put forward in this President's Commission report. And they revised the rationale with their own, called the vital work criteria. So and what an organism as a whole does is to perform a vital work. And that's the work of self-preservation achieved through the organism's need-driven commerce with the world. And so consciousness and breathing are two things that if they are irreversibly absent in that view, then you can declare death, and brain death is sufficient for that, right? So again, right, it's like, wow, this is really getting kind of crazy. Like, where are you guys coming up with this stuff? All right. Now, I should say, full disclosure at this point, your Professor O'Millianchuk has written on this topic, and I've written in defense of the President Council's idea. All right. So I want you to know that, because I think it's only fair. But, I have a paper forthcoming in a journal about this. So, but anyway, I still acknowledge that, my goodness, like what's going on here? All right. Like, haven't we made up our minds about this? All right. So that brings us to Jahi McMath. All right. This poor teenager from Oakland, California. You read this piece. All right. And just a highlight reel of that piece. I think it's one of the most wonderful pieces of investigative journalism I've ever read. She was diagnosed as dead by brain death criteria and verified by multiple sources and experts, right? Her mother obviously objected to the declaration on religious grounds. She obviously believes in the sanctity of human life, and then moved her daughter to New Jersey, where you can exercise a conscience clause and have the brain death declaration rescinded and still be counted alive, and so you can claim, Medicare and insurance benefits to take care of the brain dead body. In 2017, Schumann testified after an examination of McMath that she no longer satisfied the brain death criteria, and he's on record saying this. This is after video evidence and all this kind of stuff. It's amazing, right? Now, in 2018, this happened after the article was published. Her remaining life support sources were withdrawn, because she was suffering from incurable internal bleeding from kidney and liver failure. So if you don't think brain death is death, okay, she died in 2018, and so that's actually an issue in a lawsuit that's now pending. It's also over malpractice. But one of the issues in that lawsuit, I think, if I'm not mistaken here, is getting the public record of her brain death declaration in California that was made in 2013. There's a death certificate. Getting that expunged, right, and replacing it with the 2018 one. Right, so you can read about that on a Wikipedia link. And I just wanted to know, like, how did you personally respond to her story, right? And given all this stuff, do you agree with the Peter Singer quote that was in the article that brain death just does not seem so much like a sign of real biological death, but really actually just an ethical choice masquerading as medical fact? Okay, I want to leave you with that question, all right? And we'll pick up kind of the arguments for and against this idea, but I want you to kind of just be thinking about that, all right, as we go forward. Now, I know that was kind of a lot of history and a lot of background, right? But I think this is pretty important stuff. All right, so if you have questions, if you want to talk to me, right, hit me up in office hours over the Hangouts, or email me, or post a discussion question, and I will talk to you later.